Welcome to this event. This is a conversation with Professor Mark Jacobson, should I say. This is within the framework of the Energy Day on the version 2021. This is an event organized by three institutions, Escuela de Ingeniería de Antioquia, EIA, Universidad Jorge Tadeo Lozano, and ISA, the Colombian grid company. Is about 80% of transmission goes through ISA. And the topic of this year's event is it attainable for Colombia, 100% renewables and sustainability with renewables in electricity. And we have the pleasure and the honor to have Professor Jacobson, and he is a scholar, a well-known scholar on the topic of renewables and energy transition. He's got a bachelor's in civil engineering and economics from Stanford, a master's in environmental engineering from Stanford as well, and an MS and a PhD from in atmospheric science from UCLA. He is a professor of civil engineering and environmental engineering at Stanford and director of the program of atmospheric and energy. He's a senior fellow from Woods Institute, and he has published extensively on the topic of renewables and 100% clean and renewable energy, regarding the transition towards 100% clean and renewable energy for everything. We were now with, thanks to Dalia Patiño Echeverri. She's a professor at Duke University, and to Camila Ochoa, professor from EIA. And between the three of us are going to have a conversation with Professor Jacobson. First, I want to begin with his general thinking about his interest on decarbonization and the transition towards 100% renewable for everything. I know that you have published extensively on this, and it would take days and weeks and months to convey your thoughts on these issues. But can you provide us with a summary for the Colombian audience? And I know that this can be consulted everywhere, but we are very interested in Colombia to understand what you think about it.
Sure. Well, I've been working on understanding air pollution and climate problems since 1989 or so. And looking at my whole goal has been to try to understand these problems to come up with better solutions to them. So it was about, 12 years ago in 2009, we came up with our first plan to try to solve air pollution and climate problems through large-scale clean renewable energy. And first we did a plan to see if we can try to power the entire world with 100% renewable energy and see if there were any barriers to that. And we determined there was, technically and economically, there were not barriers, but socially and politically, those were the main barriers. Social and political barriers were the greatest. But we felt like that it was such a necessary thing to do that these social and political barriers needed to be overcome. At the time, a world plan is not very practical because there's nobody who can really implement it. And then we eventually started developing state plans for the US states and country plans for individual countries around the world. And since then have developed plans for all 50 US states and 145 countries, including Colombia, and also for over 120 cities around the world. to transition entirely to clean renewable energy. So what does that mean? Well, the main sectors are electricity, transportation, buildings, and industry. And the idea is to electrify all these sectors and provide the electricity. And there's some direct heat, but provide the electricity and direct heat with wind, water, and solar power. So that's onshore and offshore wind, solar photovoltaics on rooftops and in power plants, concentrated solar power, geothermal, and small amounts of tidal wave power, and do I say hydroelectric as well? And then, so for transportation, we go primarily to battery electric vehicles, some hydrogen fuel cell for long distance heavy transport, like long distance ships and aircraft, some long distance trucks. For buildings, we'd go to heat pumps for air heating, water heating, air conditioning. We use electric induction cooktops. We'd use heat pump dryers for drying, LED lights, energy efficiency in buildings, weatherizing homes, insulation. So, straightforward for buildings. Industry would use electric arc furnaces, induction furnaces, resistance furnaces for high temperature industrial processes, and any other heat pumps, even for medium and low temperature heat for industry. And with these technology, we have 95% of the technologies we need for such a transition already in place. The ones we don't have are for long distance ships and aircraft, but we know how to do that, just haven't commercialized them. So we want to keep it as simple as possible. We do not propose, we want to eliminate, our goal is not only to address climate, but to address air pollution. 7 million people die every year worldwide from air pollution. Hundreds of millions more are ill. And so we want to eliminate both problems at the same time. And so both problems, the main sources are combustion, and combustion of both fossil energy and bioenergy. So we want to eliminate combustion as a source of energy and go to electrification, and in some cases fuel cells, in the case of hydrogen for long distance heavy transport. So we do not include things like carbon capture, direct air capture, which all require energy and don't reduce any pollution, but increase mining because you need more energy for those, and prevent clean renewable energy. If you use renewable energy for direct air capture or carbon capture, you prevent that renewable energy from displacing fossil fuels. So we do not include direct air capture, carbon capture, bioenergy, or nuclear power. Nuclear not only is 5 times more expensive now for new nuclear compared with new onshore wind or utility solar, but takes up to 15 years longer to implement, and also has waste issues, weapons proliferation issues, meltdown risk, and uranium mining risk, and as I mentioned, waste storage for hundreds of thousands of years. So it's just, when we have other technologies already available, there's just no purpose in wasting energy or time or money on things that are less efficient and have greater risk. So we would use wind, water, and solar to provide all electricity and heat, and we transition all energy to electricity and heat. And we can keep the grid stable because we'll need storage too: electricity storage, heat storage, cold storage, some hydrogen storage, so batteries, concentrated solar power with storage, pumped hydro storage. Conventional hydropower is basically a big battery already. Then there's flywheels, gravitational storage with solid masses. These are all existing electricity storage options. We would have heat storage in water, and underground thermal energy storage in soil, in aquifers and water pits. These are existing technologies. Cold storage in ice and water, and then, as I mentioned, hydrogen storage. So with these technologies in mind, we've developed plans for all these countries and US states, and we also have done grid integration studies looking at, can we keep the grid stable in all these places? And indeed, we find that we can keep the grid stable everywhere with 100% wind, water, and solar and storage every 30 seconds for several years without any loss of load. It's really just an optimization problem. So hopefully that's a reasonable summary.
That's an excellent summary. Thank you so much, Professor Jacobson. Our question is, what are the conditions that make this transition from fossil fuels to wind, solar, and water cost effective? what are, you have argued that this is less costly than the current system we have. So what are the conditions? What are the assumptions? What needs to happen for this cost reduction to be really achievable?
Well, it's cost effective if we do it. If we don't do it, then it's more expensive. So the reason it's so cheap is because, first of all, you use about 57% less energy in an electric system powered by wind, water, and solar. I mean, because first of all, wind comes right to the turbine, solar comes right to the panel. You don't need to mine, transform, or transport solar and wind like you do fossil fuels and uranium, for example. 12% of all energy worldwide is wasted on just mining and transporting and refining fossil fuels and uranium. So we eliminate 12% there. Electric vehicles are much more efficient than internal combustion engine vehicles. You eliminate 23% of energy by transitioning to electric vehicles. Heat pumps are much more efficient than gas heaters or oil-based heaters. You eliminate about 13% of energy there. Electric industry is about 3 or 4% more efficient than fossil fuel industry. And then we can get end-use energy efficiency improvements, another 6 or 7% from that beyond business as usual. So that's a total of 57% reduction of demand just by the efficiency of electricity over combustion and using wind, water, solar. And on top of that, wind and solar now are the cheapest forms of electricity per unit energy. There's a new study that, well, every year Lazard comes out with a new cost of energy. And this week they came out with their latest cost of energy. Utility scale solar and wind, on onshore wind, are half the cost of natural gas per unit energy, conventional natural gas now, and 1/5 the cost of new nuclear power. So it's just, they're the cheapest forms of electricity on the planet. So but you do need storage associated with them. When you account for all that, you still get lower cost per unit energy combined with 57% less energy. So that's over 60% reduction of cost, annual cost that people would have to pay with clean renewable energy. On top of that, we eliminate health and climate costs. Those are called social costs. So the total social cost, including energy cost reductions, around 90% lower than fossil fuels. So in other words, if we don't transition, we're wasting a lot of money on extra energy costs and then health costs and climate costs. So this is why it's cheaper. It's cheaper from an energy, health, and climate point of view. Plus, we create more jobs on average than lost, and we end up using less land on average than the fossil fuel industry uses. So there's just very little downside to transitioning.
Yes, so Professor Jacobson, I think it's clear that these technologies are cheaper than with fossil fuels, and the demand reduction will also help. But you're talking about storage as an important part of this system to be secure, to be reliable. So how do you see that? Do you elaborate a bit more in terms of this storage needs, and which technologies do you recommend, how to implement it in the market? I mean,
right.
Market mechanisms to implement this.
Yeah, I should point out that the current energy system requires storage as well. I mean, right now, because like coal and nuclear power, for example, are baseload and they don't match demand. So you need backup, usually either hydropower or natural gas. So we're going to retain hydropower. And in fact, there are 10 countries in the world that are 100% wind, water, solar now. And they're all dominated by hydropower, although some have wind, a good portion of wind or geothermal. But hydropower is basically a big battery. So you would retain that. We're not going to grow hydro very much, if at all, but we can retain what we have and use it more effectively for backup. On top of that, pumped hydropower is the largest source of electricity storage in the world right now. So we'd retain that. That might grow a little bit. Batteries will be a big part. That will have to grow in the future, but they're nice. They don't take up much space. Their costs have come down substantially. So, and I built a new home in 2017 with solar on my roof and batteries in my garage. But the battery cost, we got 4 batteries, but the cost of the batteries was 1/5 the cost of the solar. So you don't need like huge numbers of batteries to have good backup. And I can stay on when the power goes out, my house retains power. And if you retain the power for critical loads, I could stay powered for 2 weeks with just the solar and batteries without any grid backup. Or sorry, if the solar, even if the solar goes out, I can just use the batteries for backup for 2 weeks, because appliances these days are so efficient. Refrigerators are really efficient. Even heat pumps for air heating and air conditioning are just use 1/4 the energy as gas heaters. They're just extremely efficient. LED lights are really efficient. So you don't need a lot of battery backup to power your entire home for a couple of weeks if the batteries are filled. But there are other technologies as well. There's gravitational storage with solid masses. Like when you have extra electricity, there's this technology where you just lift a concrete block to store it. You lower the concrete block when you need the electricity. That's like pumped hydro storage. There's flywheels, there's compressed air storage. So there are many technologies, and there are many types of batteries now that are being developed. Some are iron air batteries are supposed to be really cheap. They're not yet commercialized, but they're supposed to be like much less expensive than lithium ion batteries. So we have many options for electricity storage, but also we're going to be storing heat as well. I mean, most of the demand for energy, the concern is when it's in the winter, do we have enough heating? And in the summer, do we have enough cooling? And we can store heat and cold seasonally underground now. And actually for the last few decades, we just have to do that on a larger scale. You can store it for up to 6 months, and you can store heat in soil, in water pits, in aquifers, and cold storage, you can store the cold in aquifers as well. So there are a lot of options, and these are existing technologies. We just really need to implement them on a large scale.
Great. What are the requirements for the transmission and distribution grids for implementing this vision?
So we will need, well, electricity requires transmission distribution. We have a grid, but we will need to improve it and expand it. We do not, I mean, when you have a lot of storage, then the more storage you have, the less transmission distribution you need. If you have less storage, then you'll need more transmission distribution. So the two extremes are having zero storage and just interconnecting everything. And then we can usually find electricity somewhere on a continent or in the world to power, so even if the sun's down in one place, it's up in somewhere else. But in the other extreme is just having only storage and hardly any transmission. But it's probably somewhere in between is the optimal. But I think storage is winning out now because it's becoming lower in cost. It's easier to implement storage than build lots of new transmission. So we will need to improve transmission because we have wind and solar that are geographically dispersed, and we'll need to connect those to the main grids and improve the main grids. But I think if we have a lot of storage, electricity storage, that will minimize the need for transmission distribution. Sorry, you're on mute.
Thank you. Professor Jacobson, going to take a look at the Colombian case that you have studied, you said that we can move towards 100% renewable. How do you assess the transition in Colombia? What would be the challenges? And is it easier than most places? Is it more difficult? Knowing that Colombia is 70% hydro and with some storage capacity, some reservoir capacity, what do you see about this happening in Colombia?
Well, yeah, I think Colombia is very well poised because you already have this huge amount of storage ability, electricity storage. So it's really, assuming you can't grow the hydro a lot more, you'll grow solar and wind. And there's a lot of good resources of solar and wind in Colombia. But the backup is already there. You would use hydro, instead of using hydro for base load, you would use it more for backup as you grew out solar and wind. But the key first is to electrify the other energy sectors. So electrify transportation, buildings, and industry. And then you'll have more electricity demand. And then that'll result in encouragement to build out more solar and wind. And then you'll see that the hydro works really well as backup in that case. So any country that has a lot of hydro already is perfectly situated to go to 100% clean renewable energy. as I mentioned, there are already 10 countries that are 100% clean, renewable electricity, wind, water, solar in the annual average, and they're all dominated by hydro. So Colombia is very well poised to be another one of these countries, but also to transition the other sectors to electricity first or at the same time, and to grow out the renewables in order to meet those new demands. And that will help to eliminate reliance on either mining fossil fuels or importing fossil fuels, which will lower energy costs and reduce risk. Because whenever you're importing fuels, there's always a risk of price fluctuations, or the source dries up at some point. And so it's always better to be able to produce your own energy. Having said that, it's good if Colombia is interconnected with other countries nearby for the grid, because it's more, we've always found that interconnecting countries reduces costs even further compared with just trying to power the country on its own with its own renewables. Even though it can be done and it's cheaper than fossil fuels to power your own country with renewables, it's less expensive even to interconnect with other countries and sometimes supply them and sometimes receive energy from them to trade energy, because to balance the solar and wind, for example, when it's not blowing or shining.
Yeah, that's fair. And we have conducted some simulations, and in theory, it works. But there are challenges in terms of policy and regulation, and those are not in place. And if you don't move ahead with the right regulation, you end up with the worst of all worlds. So what do you think we should do about this?
Well, certainly social and political barriers are probably the greatest barriers to implementing a transition. So technically and economically, it can be done on paper, but if there are barriers, they're usually going to be either economic groups or political groups that are opposed to transitioning because they want to maintain the status quo. Regulations can be changed. So if there are regulations, then, and if this is an important transition, then the regulations would be updated or modified to allow a transition. Because hasn't been contemplated until recently to even do such a large transition on a short time frame. So you're going to have lots of regulations in place that have favored the current energy infrastructure. Without knowing what specific regulation you're referring to, it's hard to comment on that. But so I was trying to just be general about my answer. I don't know if you have one in mind.
I've got a few more questions. I don't know about your time, but I don't know about Camila and Dalia having something to ask you, and if you provide us and give us a little more time for.
Yeah, I have time.
Thank you, Dalia, Camila.
I'm just very intrigued about the storage, the diversity of storage technologies that you have considered in your studies. And I know that at the beginning they seemed like very small scale, so what is the storage technology that has really surprised you and that you see really playing a big role in the transition?
Well, battery costs coming down have surprised me that fast. And I think they're rapidly coming down and they're rapidly being implemented. And so that surprised me. I've also, pumped hydro has actually surprised me, because I thought, well, it's not going to grow, but I actually see a lot of places around the world where pumped hydro is actually growing even more than I thought. And then also the diversity of battery technologies. There's just so many different types of battery technologies being developed, and that's helping to drive down the cost and also giving promise that there will be some ones that will be really cheap. And once it's really cheap, then there's no issue anymore, because we already know solar and wind are cheap, and it's just people are concerned about keeping the grid stable. And once you can do that, you can also develop lots more microgrids where you don't have to be connected to the grid, the main grid. You can have communities that provide their own electricity, and that's very important there are a lot of remote communities where people don't have power, And there are a lot of communities also in many countries where people cook and heat their homes with burning fuel or dung or waste. And that causes, of the 7 million people who die from air pollution each year, about 2.5 million are from indoor burning of biomass and coal for home heating and cooking. And so if we can get more microgrids and we're running on some solar and batteries, then people can use induction cooktops, use more heat pumps for heating, and eliminate the burning of fuel in their homes. And that could save a lot of lives and reduce health costs in countries substantially.
And in terms of market mechanisms to implement these batteries, do you see it only in, like prosumers installing batteries, like in your case, or do you see these batteries as something bigger?
Well, yeah, so the batteries are going to be used on the utility scale, so large scale, but also individuals. And as I mentioned, I think just having one or two batteries, if you have a solar system in your house or apartment complex or anywhere, any residence or building, you only need like one or two batteries really to stay 90% off the grid. I mean, just a couple batteries or even one battery will result in a huge savings. It's just that to get 100%, like to go 100% off the grid, then you need, could be 8, 9, or 10 batteries. So, but you can get 90% of your success with one or two batteries. You don't need to go all the way to 100% because eventually the grid will be 100% renewables as well. And so this is really just a hedge, for emergencies. So individual homes don't need to be 100% off the grid. So I think it's going to be a combination of utility scale. That's where you'll get the most effectiveness because utilities can buy batteries in bulk and you get the lowest costs, and that's where it'll be the cheapest. Individuals, if they purchase batteries, let's say in a group of a community of like 5 or 10 homes, that can also be really inexpensive too, less expensive than if one individual purchases batteries.
You're mute.
Sorry again. How cheap is solar electricity today? You said is less than half of fossil fuels technology in terms of generation. It's just to give you an idea of what happened in Colombia the day before yesterday in an auction we had on renewables, and it, for my taste, it didn't come out nicely.
So there was an auction for renewables, and the renewables were bid high, or what?
I believe, what do you think? 5 cents of dollar high, or?
Well, no. Now they're about 3 cents a kilowatt hour now for utility solar, and natural gas is about 6 cents a kilowatt hour. The price depends on the solar resource. So like this 2 to 3 cents a kilowatt hour may be in the Southwest desert, whereas if you're in a rain region, you're going to, like a more cloudy region, then you're going to get 4 or 5 cents. So it could depend on the. But there's also some other things, like there might be additional costs, like to connect to the grid as well, as opposed to just the panels. And so a lot of things go into those cost estimates. But anyway, it's still cheaper than gas and coal right now. So I think even 4 or 5 cents. I don't know what the gas was bidding. Did gas bid in that as well?
No, only renewables, only solar actually.
Yeah. So I'm sure if gas bid, there would probably be 7 or 8 cents a kilowatt hour.
It could have been more expensive. I don't know what else we have to ask Mark, not to use most.
I just want to thank you very much for your time and for looking at different countries and paying attention to Colombia. Just thank you very much for that.
Yeah, you're welcome. I'm glad you're interested in this as well. So, what are you planning to do next what's the rest of this project involving?
The idea with this is to bring the attention of the specialists, the community, the energy community in Colombia, because here we're just starting with the transition towards renewables. And it was very slow until 2019. And this government was forced to move into renewables because, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but we had a failure with a hydroelectric plant that was going to supply about 17% of the electricity for Colombia. And so it's delayed. It was supposed to start in 2018. And now the future says that not before 2022. So there is some electricity that is needed. So,
interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting because it's not that Colombia is turning renewable because of the concerns of environmental change and or the crisis, the environmental crisis, but because it's being forced to do it, because it's the cheapest and quickest source to take into consideration. No?
Yeah, well, hopefully everybody's surprised at how good it is.
All right, thank you very much, Mark. It was a pleasure to have you, and I hope that many people in Colombia take a look at what you've been writing and what you've been doing and your thoughts on these issues.
All right, well, thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Accepting this invitation.
All right,
Bye-bye.
take care. Bye.
Take care.
Bye.